They called him a monster. They were wrong. And one woman working the midnight shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere was about to find out exactly how wrong they were, at the worst possible moment. Before you hear what happened that night, I want to say something. This story changed the way I think about trust, about sacrifice, and about what it really means to do the right thing. When doing the right thing costs you everything. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now sit back, because this one's going to take you somewhere. The gas station didn't have a name anymore. Whatever letters had once spelled something out across the top of the canopy had long since fallen off or faded into illegibility, leaving only a rusted bracket and the ghost of old paint. The pumps were the kind with physical buttons and a card reader that ate your card half the time and spit it back out without explanation. The fluorescent lights buzzed like they were in pain. One of them flickered every 40 seconds. Emily had counted more than once during the long stretches of nothing that made up most of her nights. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday in late August when the black car pulled in. Not many cars came through at that hour. The gas station sat on Route 9, about 12 miles outside of Calverton, which wasn't much of a town to begin with, and hadn't been much of anything since the Ashford manufacturing plant shut down 18 months ago. Before that, Route 9 had been a commuter road, carrying the graveyard shift workers to and from the plant in the dark. Now it carried almost nothing, a trucker sometimes, a teenager with nowhere else to go, the occasional lost traveler who'd missed the highway exit and was too embarrassed to admit how far off course they'd gotten. The black car, though, that was a different animal entirely. It was a Mercedes, not the kind of Mercedes you bought because it was a sensible upgrade. The kind of Mercedes that said the person inside had never once in their life worried about whether they could afford the car payment. Clean, dark, completely out of place on a road that still had potholes from 3 winters ago that the county hadn't gotten around to fixing. Emily watched it pull up to pump 2 through the scratched plexiglass window of the booth. She was in the middle of restocking the cooler with water bottles that had arrived warm on the delivery truck, which meant she was doing the restocking herself because her coworker, Devante, had called in sick for the 3rd Tuesday in a row. She'd stopped being annoyed about it. She didn't have the energy anymore for annoyances that didn't actively threaten her ability to pay rent. The driver's door opened. She recognized him before she fully processed who she was looking at. Landon Ashford was taller than she'd expected. She'd seen his face in the newspaper a dozen times over the past year and a half. On the front page the day the plant closed, again when 340 families filed the class action lawsuit, again when the town council posted those photographs of him outside the shareholder meeting looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. In the photographs, he always seemed somehow smaller than the chaos around him. In person, he was not small at all. He had dark circles under his eyes that no amount of money could fix. His jacket was expensive. She could tell from the cut of it, but it was rumpled in a way that suggested he'd either been sleeping in it or hadn't slept at all. He moved with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had gotten used to the weight without getting comfortable with it. He didn't look at her. He stuck his credit card into the pump, and it actually worked, which she noted as a minor miracle, and started filling his tank. Emily went back to the water bottles. She was 30 years old, and she'd been working the night shift at this gas station for 14 months. Before that, she'd worked days at the diner on 5th, but the diner had closed 8 weeks after the plant did because most of its customers were plant workers, and plant workers without paychecks don't eat out. She had a degree in accounting from the state university, which she'd gotten at 22, and which had proven considerably less useful than advertised. She'd come back to Calverton to take care of her father after his first cardiac event 2 years ago, and she'd told herself it was temporary, and then the diner closed, and then she got the gas station job. And here she was at 11:47 on a Tuesday restocking water bottles under a flickering light. She heard the pump click off. Then she heard the car door close. Then she heard the engine start. She was back at the register by the time the Mercedes pulled away, and she stood there for a moment just watching the red taillights disappear down Route 9 into the dark. She noticed the briefcase about 30 seconds later. It was sitting on the ground next to the pump. Black leather, combination lock, the kind of bag that corporations had stopped using for actual documents and private individuals still use specifically because they wanted to keep things locked. It blended in with the shadow at the base of the pump, which was probably why she almost missed it. But the flickering light caught it on one of its upswings, and she saw the metal clasp glint. She went out to get it. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it inside and set it on the counter and looked at it for a long moment. She'd worked retail and service long enough to know the routine for lost items. Tag it, put it in the back, call the number on the receipt if there was one, fill out the incident form that no one ever actually read. That was the routine. She looked at the briefcase. She looked at the road where the Mercedes had gone. She went to the register and pulled up the receipt on the screen. Ashford L. The card had a billing address on it, which was technically not information she was supposed to use for anything, but which she looked at anyway. An estate outside of Millfield, 20 minutes north. She knew people in Millfield. She knew the road. She stood there for probably 3 full minutes, just thinking. There was a voice in her head, not her conscience exactly, more like the collected opinions of everyone in Calverton she'd ever known, telling her to put the briefcase in the back and fill out the incident form and let it be someone else's problem. That man had destroyed this town. Her father had worked the plant for 22 years. He'd had to take a part-time job at 61 years old with a damaged heart because his pension had evaporated overnight. Whatever was in that briefcase was Landon Ashford's problem, not hers. Let him figure it out. But there was something else she kept coming back to.
About a year ago, maybe a little more, she'd been closing up on a Friday night when she saw a car pull in that she recognized. The Garibaldi family. They'd lived 2 streets over from her parents since before she was born, and Maria Garibaldi had been crying in the passenger seat, and her husband Carlos had that jaw-set look of a man trying very hard to keep it together. Their oldest boy, Marcus, had a seizure condition. He'd had one at school. The ambulance bill had come while Carlos was dealing with being laid off, and they were 2 weeks from losing their apartment. She'd overheard this because the Garibaldis were not quiet people, and the gas station booth was small and the window was open. She hadn't known what to do about it, so she'd done nothing, and felt bad about it all weekend. Monday morning there was a money order taped to the Garibaldis' front door. No note, no name. Carlos had shown it to her father, who'd told Emily, who'd done the math quietly on her own. The amount matched, almost exactly, what Marcus's ambulance bill would have been. Carlos had thought maybe it was from the church. Her father had thought it was from one of the other laid-off workers pulling together. But Emily had been working the night before the money order appeared, and she'd seen the black Mercedes slow down on the street across from the Garibaldi place before driving on. She'd never said anything about it. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know if it meant anything. One quiet act of charity didn't cancel 340 destroyed livelihoods. She was fully aware of that, but it lodged itself in her memory in a place she couldn't quite dislodge it from. And standing here now with this briefcase on the counter, it was what she kept coming back to. She turned off the extra lights in the booth, flipped the sign, and called the overnight number for her supervisor to let him know she was taking her break early and might run a little long. Her supervisor, who was asleep, told her that was fine and hung up. She picked up the briefcase and walked to her car. It took her 40 minutes, not 20, because she missed the turnoff in the dark and had to double back. The road to the Ashford estate wasn't marked well. A deliberate choice, she imagined, made by someone who didn't want to make themselves easy to find. She drove through a tunnel of old oak trees that her headlights barely dented, and then the trees opened up and the house was just there, suddenly lit up along the front by ground-level lights that made it look almost like something out of a magazine. She sat in her car for a moment. "This is probably a bad idea," she said out loud to no one. Then she got out. She was halfway up the stone walkway when the front door opened. The man who appeared in the doorway was not the composed, distant figure from the newspaper photographs. He looked like he'd been standing somewhere in the house doing some version of panicking for the past half hour. His jacket was off, his shirt was half untucked. He had a phone in one hand and the look of someone in the middle of a search that wasn't going well. He looked at her. Then he looked at what she was carrying. Something happened in his expression that she didn't have a word for. "Where did you—" he started. "Pump toots," she said. "You left it when you drove off." He came down the steps faster than she expected, and she held the briefcase out to him and he took it, and for a second he just stood there holding it like he didn't quite believe it was real. "You drove out here," he said. 40 minutes, she confirmed, "which means I should probably get back or my boss is going to notice. I'll pay you for your time." "I don't need you to pay me." Well, she said it without heat. It wasn't a statement about him. It was just the truth. I just figured you'd want it back. It looked important. It is. He said it in a way that meant considerably more than those two words. He stopped. You're Emily Carter. She blinked. You know who I am? Your father worked in the finishing department. 22 years. He said it like he'd memorized it, like he'd memorized a lot of names. I'm sorry for what happened to him, to all of them. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away in the same uncomfortable place where she kept the memory of the money order. You should know, she said carefully, that I don't know what's in that briefcase. And I didn't look. I just thought you should have it back. He nodded slowly. He looked down at the briefcase. In the ground lighting, she could see his face better than she wanted to. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just tonight. He looked tired in a way that had been building for a long time. Thank you, he said, for trusting, for not just... He exhaled. Thank you. She was almost back to her car when she heard the second vehicle coming up the drive. It pulled in behind her, a dark sedan different from the Mercedes, the kind of car that meant business in an unpleasant way. The woman who got out was in her 50s, sharply dressed even at this hour, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being the most prepared person in every room she entered. Emily recognized her from the newspaper too. Victoria Marsh. She was Landon's corporate attorney, head of legal counsel for Ashford Industries. The woman who'd been standing behind him in every press photograph. The one who always looked like she was calculating the damage before anyone else had even processed that something had gone wrong. Landon? Her voice was carefully controlled. Her eyes found the briefcase immediately. Where did you... I thought that was... She stopped, stared at the briefcase in his hands with an expression that lasted maybe half a second before she locked it down, but Emily caught it. It wasn't relief. That's what it should have been, if she'd been worried about losing important documents. But it wasn't relief. It was something closer to dread. Landon caught it too. Emily saw the moment he caught it. His grip on the briefcase shifted almost imperceptibly, and his face went neutral in the practiced way of someone who'd learned not to let his reactions show. Victoria, he said, I didn't know you were stopping by tonight. I was in the area. A pause. I'm glad you found it. I didn't find it, he said. He glanced at Emily. It was returned to me. Victoria Marsh looked at Emily for the first time, assessed her in about 2 seconds, dismissed her in about 3. Well, she said. Good. Can we go inside? There are things we need to discuss before tomorrow. Landon looked at Emily. There was something in the look, not quite an apology, not quite an ask, more like a person making a very fast calculation with very high stakes. Miss Carter, he said, formally, which was strange given that 5 minutes ago they'd been standing in the driveway talking like people. Would you mind... He stopped, started again differently. There's something I need to ask you, and it's a large ask, and you're completely within your rights to say no. She had a shift to get back to. She had a father at home who was sleeping but who sometimes woke up at odd hours and needed help. She had absolutely no reason to stand here in this driveway at 12:47 in the morning, getting involved in whatever this was. What is it? She asked. He glanced at Victoria, then back at Emily. Not in front of... He stopped again. Come inside. 10 minutes. That's all I need. Emily looked at her car. She looked at the briefcase. She looked at Victoria Marsh, who was looking at the briefcase with an expression she was working very hard to make neutral. She thought about her father. She thought about Marcus Garibaldi. She thought about the money order and the black Mercedes slowing down on that dark street. 10 minutes, she said. The inside of the house was not what she'd expected. She'd anticipated something that announced wealth, the kind of decorating that was really just expensive things arranged to demonstrate that the owner could afford expensive things. What she found instead was a house that looked like it was in the middle of being lived in by an actual person. There were papers on the dining table, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen door, something that might have been a dog or possibly a very round horse, a mug on the hall table that still had coffee in it. She thought, there's a kid here. Landon led her to his study and closed the door. Through it, she could hear Victoria pacing somewhere in the house.
He set the briefcase on the desk and opened it with the combination, and she looked away out of reflex because it wasn't her business what was in it. But he said, "You can look. I want you to understand what this is." She looked. Files. A lot of files. Documents with dates going back 8 or 9 years, photographs. And on top of everything else, in a clear plastic sleeve, an old photograph. The kind printed on actual photo paper, slightly faded, maybe 20 years old. 2 men shaking hands in front of the plant. One she didn't recognize. The other one she did, even if she'd only seen him in the old photos her father kept. "That's your father," she said. "Yes." "He was the plant manager." "Yes." She looked at him. "Everyone says you're the one who—" "I know what everyone says." His voice was steady. Too steady. Like a person who'd said a difficult sentence in his head so many times that saying it out loud had stopped hurting. "I need you to keep that photograph for 3 days. Not here. Not at your house, necessarily. I mean, yes, your house. Or anywhere you feel is safe. Somewhere no one would think to look for something valuable." She stared at him. "You want me to hide evidence? I want you to keep something safe that people with significant resources are going to try very hard to find." "That's the same thing." "Yes," he said, "it is." "Why me?" He met her eyes. "Because you drove 40 miles in the middle of the night to return something that most people would have kept or ignored. Because your father worked in that plant for 22 years and you know what this town lost. Because," he exhaled, "because you're the only person who showed up tonight and I'm running out of people I can trust." The last part landed differently than the rest of it. Not as an appeal, more as a fact that he was clearly not comfortable admitting. Through the closed door, Victoria's pacing stopped. Emily looked at the photograph, at the 2 men and the plant behind them in a time before everything fell apart. She thought about what her father had looked like the morning he'd gotten the termination notice, how he'd sat at the kitchen table for a long time without saying anything, and how that had been worse than if he'd cried. She reached into the briefcase and took the photograph. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She tucked the photograph into her jacket against her chest, and she walked back out through the house and past Victoria Marsh without making eye contact and out into the night air. She got into her car and sat for a second before starting the engine. Her hands were not entirely steady. She pulled out of the driveway and back through the tunnel of oak trees, and she was almost to Route 9 before she noticed, in her rearview mirror, the dark SUV that had pulled out of a side road and was now keeping pace, 3 car lengths behind her, in no particular hurry. She drove. She didn't change her speed. She didn't give any sign that she'd noticed. She just drove, with her hand pressed flat against her chest, against the photograph she was carrying, and she thought, whatever this is, I'm already in it. The gas station appeared ahead, its flickering light still buzzing in the dark, and she pulled in and parked and sat in her car for a long moment, watching the SUV cruise slowly past without stopping. Then she went back inside. She had 3 hours left on her shift. She restocked the rest of the water bottles. She didn't sleep when she got home. She tried. She lay on top of the covers in her work clothes with her shoes still on, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Ohio. And she thought about the SUV that had followed her and then kept going. And she thought about Landon Ashford's face when he'd opened that briefcase. And she thought about Victoria Marsh's expression in the driveway, that half second of something that wasn't relief. And eventually she gave up on sleep entirely and went to sit at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the photograph lying flat in front of her. She hadn't meant to take it out. She'd told herself she was going to put it somewhere secure and not think about it until Landon came to collect it. But here it was on her kitchen table at 4 a.m, and here she was looking at it. 2 men shaking hands in front of the plant. The building behind them still new-looking, the signage clean, the parking lot empty in a way that suggested the photograph was taken early on a weekend or before the workforce arrived. The man on the left she didn't know, late 50s maybe, expensive suit, the particular posture of someone who was used to being the most important person in the room. The man on the right was Robert Ashford. She was certain of it, not because she had a clear memory of his face, but because her father had a photograph of him too, taken at the plant's 20-year anniversary party. And the resemblance to Landon was specific enough that there was no mistaking the family line. Robert Ashford had been the plant manager. He'd run that facility for 2 decades, and by every account from everyone her father had ever mentioned, he'd been the kind of manager who knew his employees' kids' names. He'd died 3 years ago, a year before everything fell apart. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil that someone had gone over in pen to preserve it, a date, 9 years ago, and 2 words that meant nothing to her out of context but that sat in her stomach like something cold. They know. She put the photograph back in its plastic sleeve and went to her bedroom closet and put it inside the lining of a winter coat she hadn't worn in 2 years and pushed it to the back. Then she made coffee and waited for her father to wake up. He came out at 6:15, moving slowly the way he always did in the morning, his right hand pressed against his lower back in the unconscious gesture of a man whose body was holding a running tally of grievances against him. Gerald Carter was 63 years old, and he moved like someone significantly older, which was the cardiac medication partly, and the 2 part-time jobs partly, and grief partly, though he would never have called it grief. He called it being tired. He'd been calling it tired for about a year and a half. "You didn't sleep," he said, looking at her. "I slept a little." He looked at the coffee she was already on her second cup of, and did not say anything about that. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily and reached for the coffee pot. "Something happened at work?" She considered her answer. Her father was not a man who responded well to being protected from information, and she'd learned that the hard way during the first few weeks after his cardiac event when she'd tried to keep things from him, and he'd been furious when he found out. But she also didn't have enough information herself to explain what had happened without making it sound worse than she knew it to be, or possibly not as bad, and she genuinely couldn't tell which. "A customer left something behind," she said. "I returned it." He poured his coffee. "That's it?" "That's mostly it." He looked at her over the rim of his mug with the expression that meant he was deciding whether to press. He decided not to. He was better at picking his moments than she sometimes gave him credit for. "I'm going in for the afternoon shift at the hardware store," he said. "Should be back by 7. "Okay." "There's leftover soup in the fridge, huh?" He stood, bones making various complaints. "Eat something before you sleep. You look like you've been up all night thinking about something you shouldn't be thinking about." She watched him disappear down the hall to get ready and thought, he's not wrong. She went to bed at 7 and set her alarm for noon and dreamed about the plant. Not the empty husk it was now, but the way it had been, the sound of it, the particular smell of metal and oil and heat that had clung to her father's work clothes when she was a kid, and that she'd hated then and would give almost anything to smell again now. She woke up at 11 to 3 missed calls from an unknown number. She lay in bed looking at her phone for a long moment. The calls were spaced out. One at 8:40, one at 9:15, one at 10:50. No voicemails. She set the phone face down on the nightstand and went to brush her teeth and tried to think clearly about what to do, which was difficult because she hadn't slept enough and her brain wasn't operating at full capacity. She was in the middle of making toast when her phone rang again. Same unknown number. She picked up. "Miss Carter?" The voice was male, older, professionally calm in a way that felt manufactured rather than natural. "I apologize for calling so early. My name is Dennis Falco. I'm a private investigator. I've been hired to locate certain documents related to Ashford Industries, and I have reason to believe you may be in possession of something that was taken from my client's secured files." She stood very still. "I think you have the wrong number," she said. "I don't believe I do." A pause. "I'm not here to cause you any difficulty, Miss Carter. My client simply wants what belongs to them returned. There would be compensation for your cooperation. Significant compensation." "I restocked water bottles and swept the floor last night," she said. "That's the extent of what happened at my job." "I don't know what you're talking about." She hung up. Then she stood in her kitchen with her toast burning in the toaster and her heart rate doing something it shouldn't, and she thought about what Landon Ashford had said. People with significant resources are going to try very hard to find it. She'd understood that abstractly at 1 in the morning in his study. She understood it considerably less abstractly right now. She called the number he'd given her. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd either been awake or had been waiting for her to call. "Someone called me," she said. "A man named Dennis Falco. He said he's a private investigator." A beat of silence. "What did he say?" "That he was looking for documents taken from his client's secured files and that he thought I had them." She paused. He offered compensation. Don't talk to him again. I already hung up. Good. She heard him moving, footsteps, a door closing somewhere. I'm sorry, I didn't think they'd move this fast. Who is they? Another pause, longer this time. The kind of pause that meant the answer was complicated, and he was deciding how much of the complicated answer to give her over the phone. I'll explain everything. Can I come to you? She thought about her father leaving for the hardware store at noon. She thought about the unknown number calling 3 times before she'd picked up. She thought about the SUV in her rear-view mirror at 1 in the morning. No, she said, not here. She thought for a second. The gas station, noon. My supervisor won't be in until 3. I'll be there. She ate her burned toast standing over the sink and tried to remember the last time she'd felt like she was in control of a situation and couldn't. He arrived at the gas station at 12 minutes past noon in a different car. A truck, older, the kind of vehicle that didn't announce itself. She let him in through the side door and locked it behind them. The gas station in daylight looked worse than it did at night, which was saying something. The fluorescent light that flickered all night had given up the ghost entirely and was now just dead. A box of inventory she hadn't gotten to sat in the corner. He looked worse than he had the night before. She hadn't thought that was possible, but she was revising her assessment in real time. Someone inside your company, she said, before he could say anything. That's what you think. He sat down on the stool behind the counter. She gestured at it because he looked like he needed to sit, and he put his hands flat on the laminate surface and looked at them for a moment. Victoria has been my attorney for 6 years. She's been with Ashford Industries longer than I've been running it. When I saw her face last night, she didn't look relieved, Emily said. He looked up. No, she didn't. He exhaled. Someone told the people looking for that briefcase where it would be and when. Victoria was one of 4 people who knew I was driving that route last night. What's in those files, Landon? She'd used his first name without meaning to. She didn't correct it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car went past on Route 9 without stopping. My father ran that plant for 22 years, he said. And for most of those 22 years, he was doing it right, genuinely right. The workers had good benefits, the safety record was clean, the town was doing well. But about 9 years ago, he started getting pressure from the primary investors, a group of men who'd bought significant stakes in the company quietly over about an 18-month period. They wanted to restructure, downsize the workforce, cut the benefits package, change the supply contracts to use cheaper materials. Your father said no. My father said no. A small, complicated expression crossed his face. He documented everything, every meeting, every demand, every threat. He kept physical copies because he didn't trust the digital infrastructure. He was old-fashioned that way. And those copies ended up in my hands when he died, along with a letter telling me what they'd done and asking me to make it right. Emily sat down on the footstool she used to reach the top shelf of the cigarette rack. They killed him. He had a heart attack 2 years after they finally pushed him out and took over the plant themselves. He said it flatly, without performance. I can't prove the stress of what they did to him contributed to it. I can't prove a lot of things. That's the problem. What I can prove, what's in those files, is that the investors deliberately ran the plant into the ground to justify seizing the land. The factory closure wasn't a business failure. It was a planned demolition. They wanted the property. There's industrial development money attached to that land that makes the plant's annual revenue look like pocket change. She thought about her father's face at the kitchen table with the termination notice. She thought about 340 families. She thought about the class action lawsuit and the newspaper photographs and a town that had spent 18 months blaming the wrong person. You let them blame you, she said. Yes. For 1.5 years. Yes. While you were gathering evidence. She looked at him. Why didn't you just go to the authorities with what you had? Because what I had wasn't enough. Not at first. The documents my father left me established motive and pattern, but they were 18 months old by the time I got them, and the investors had spent that time very carefully cleaning up behind themselves. I needed more current evidence. I needed them to move. He looked at her steadily. Innocent men are easy to frame. Guilty men are easy to provoke. If I looked like I was hiding something, Like I was the one who had something to lose, they'd get anxious. They'd start reaching. And when they reached, they'd leave marks. So you built a trap, Emily said, and used yourself as the bait. Something like that. That's a terrible plan. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but the attempt was there. It's worked so far. Has it? Because last night someone followed me home from your house, and this morning I got a phone call from a private investigator. The almost smile disappeared. I know, and I'm sorry. I genuinely didn't think they'd move on you so fast. He hesitated. Miss Carter, Emily. Emily. He said it like he was reminding himself of something. I need you to understand what you're holding on to. That photograph is the link between my father and the lead investor, a man named Garrett Holloway, in the weeks before my father was pushed out. The date on it matters. The handshake matters. It proves they had a relationship they've denied under oath. The two words on the back, she said. They know. His jaw tightened. My father wrote that. He was the one who'd figured out what Holloway's group was planning. He was documenting it. A beat. He knew it was dangerous. He kept documenting it anyway. She thought about that. About a man who'd known he was in trouble and had kept writing things down anyway, keeping physical copies because he didn't trust the digital infrastructure, trying to build something his son could use even if he didn't live to see it used. Why does Victoria want it? She asked. If she's been working for you, she's been working adjacent to me. There's a board meeting in 4 days. If I present those documents at the board meeting with the photograph as the capstone, Holloway's group loses everything. The contracts, the land acquisition, the development deal, all of it. If the photograph disappears before then, the chain of evidence has a critical gap. He looked at his hands. Victoria has been managing my legal strategy for 6 years. She knows exactly where every gap in that chain is. Emily let that settle. The fluorescent light buzzed. A truck went past outside on Route 9, shaking the windows slightly the way heavy trucks always did on this road. Who's Dennis Falco working for? She asked. Actually working for? Holloway's people. He's been on their payroll for years. He was involved in the original operation to get my father out. I didn't know he was back in play until you called me this morning. She looked at him. You know a lot about someone who was apparently a surprise. I've spent 14 months learning everything there is to know about the people who did this. No apology in his voice, just the flatness of someone who'd done an ugly job for a long time. Falco was the one who helped them execute the original plan. He gathered information on my father, found the pressure points, helped them build a case to present to the secondary investors that made it look like Robert Ashford was the problem. He paused. He's good at what he does. If he's calling you, he already knows more than I'd like him to know. Outside, a car pulled into the gas station. Emily stood automatically and went to the window and looked out. A minivan. A woman getting out, 2 kids in the back, ordinary midday, ordinary life. The woman came to the door, found it locked, looked confused, and went back to her car. Emily watched her drive away. I need to know something, she said, not turning from the window. And I need you to answer me straight. Okay? Did your father's decisions, the ones he made while he was managing the plant, did any of them make things harder for the workers? Before Holloway's group got involved, was he perfect? A long silence. No, Landon said. He wasn't perfect. There were decisions he made in the early years that I think he'd have made differently, later. He had a contractor issue in year 4 that he handled badly, and 3 people got hurt. He made a call about overtime pay in year 8 that I don't think he'd defend if he were here. He paused. He was a man who made decisions under pressure with incomplete information, and some of those decisions were wrong. But he never deliberately harmed anyone for personal gain. And when Holloway's group showed up, he said no when he could have said yes and retired comfortably. She turned around. He was looking at her directly. That's the honest answer, he said. I'm not trying to make him into something he wasn't. I'm trying to make sure the people who deliberately destroyed this town face what they did. She looked at him for a long moment, looked at the exhaustion in him that wasn't tonight's exhaustion, that had been accumulating for longer than she'd known he existed as a real person rather than a newspaper photograph. Okay, she said. Okay? The photograph stays where it is. She went back to the counter. 3 days, board meeting, you come back for it when it's done. He exhaled slowly, like a man who'd been holding his breath for longer than was healthy. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. She said it without being harsh, more just accurate. Falco called me this morning. He's going to call again, or something worse than call. You need to tell me what to do if that happens. Don't engage, don't confirm or deny anything. If he shows up in person, I'm not going to talk to him. Good. If anything feels wrong, call me. Doesn't matter what time. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. Not a business card, just a number written on a piece of paper, which she thought said more about his current state of mind than almost anything else about the past 12 hours. That's the number I'll actually answer. Not the office, not the main line. She took it. There's a kid at your house. He went still. I saw the drawing on the refrigerator, she said. Not an accusation, just placing it on the table. My daughter. She's 5. He said it carefully, the way people say things when they're protecting something. She stays with my sister when things are complicated. Are things complicated right now? Things are extremely complicated right now. Then make sure she stays with your sister. She said it directly, not gently. If Falco and these people are willing to follow a gas station attendant home in the middle of the night, you need to think about who else they're willing to move on. He looked at her. She could see him processing the fact that she'd just said something he should have thought of himself and probably had, but needed to hear from outside his own head. You're right, he said. I'll call my sister today. Good. She unlocked the front door and flipped the sign back to open. There was a car already waiting at Pump 1. A regular, she recognized the truck. A contractor named Pete, who came in every Wednesday for a coffee and a lottery ticket he never won. Landon stood and put on his jacket. He looked like a man pulling himself back together from several different directions. One more thing, Emily said as he moved toward the side door. Last year, the Garibaldi family. Was that you? He stopped. His back was to her. Their son had a seizure at school, she said. The medical bill. The money order with no name. A moment of silence. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. He said it so badly that they both knew he was lying, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything else about it. He left through the side door, and she watched his truck pull out onto Route 9, and she went to make Pete's coffee. Her hands were steadier than they'd been the night before. She wasn't sure what that meant, whether she'd gotten used to being scared, or whether she'd passed through something and come out on the other side of it. She thought about the photograph in the lining of her winter coat. She thought about "they know" written in pencil, and then traced over in pen by a man who was building something he knew he might not survive to see completed. She thought about Landon Ashford saying, I'm trying to make sure the people who deliberately destroyed this town face what they did with that particular kind of quiet. That wasn't calmness, but was something more like a decision that had already been made and settled into. Pete knocked on the glass. She went and poured his coffee. Outside on Route 9, a dark SUV, different from last night's, she was almost certain, but she couldn't be entirely sure, slowed as it passed the gas station and then kept going and disappeared over the hill. The second day was worse than the first. Emily worked her shift, came home, made dinner for her father, and spent the whole evening pretending nothing was happening while her father watched the news and occasionally made comments about the weather and the price of lumber and a city council decision he disagreed with. She sat on the couch next to him and said the right things at the right intervals, and kept her phone face up on the cushion beside her so she could see if Landon called, and kept her eyes moving to the front window whenever headlights swept past on the street outside. Gerald noticed the phone thing. He didn't say anything about it, which was somehow worse. She slept badly and woke up early and went to check on the coat before she did anything else, which she knew was irrational. No one had been in the house. No one knew about the coat. But she checked anyway, and the photograph was there in its plastic sleeve, and she made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the street for a long moment before she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. The third day brought rain. A proper August rain, the kind that came in off the hills and settled in for the afternoon, heavy and gray, and making everything look like it was being seen through old glass. Emily's father left for his shift at the hardware store at noon with an umbrella he'd borrowed from the neighbor 3 weeks ago and kept forgetting to return. She watched him go and then stood at the kitchen table and looked at her phone. Landon had called the night before. Brief, low-voiced, careful. The board meeting was tomorrow morning. He'd said thank you again, and she'd told him to stop thanking her, and he'd said he'd be at the gas station by 8 to collect the photograph. And she'd said fine, and they'd hung up. And she'd stood in the hallway for a while, thinking about how strange it was to feel implicated in something this large when all she'd done was return a briefcase. She had a shift starting at 10. She was thinking about the photograph and whether to carry it with her or leave it in the coat until morning when the car pulled up in front of the house. She almost didn't register it. Cars pulled up on this street constantly. But something about the timing, 2:17 in the afternoon, the rain coming down, no reason for anyone to be parking in front of her house, made her step back from the window instead of moving away from it. The car sat there for about 40 seconds. Then the door opened and a man got out. Dennis Falco was shorter than his voice had suggested, late 50s raincoat, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had determined that the person they were visiting had nowhere to go. He came up the front walk and knocked on the door with the particular knock of a person who expects the door to be answered. Emily stood in the hallway. She looked at the door. She thought about not answering it. She answered it. "Miss Carter." He had a wide face and small eyes and the kind of professionally pleasant expression that didn't reach anything behind it. "I appreciate you opening the door. I know we got off to a rough start on the phone. What do you want?" "Just a conversation." He looked past her into the hallway, a quick assessment that he barely bothered to hide. "May I come in?" "No?" A small adjustment of his expression. Not offense, just recalibration. "That's fine. We can do this here." He reached into his raincoat and produced a card and held it out. She didn't take it. He left it balanced on the porch railing. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Carter, because I think you're a smart person, and I don't think you know what you've actually gotten involved in." "Then tell me." "Landon Ashford has been building a case against the investors who backed his company for 14 months. He said it calmly, the way someone delivers information they want to seem like they're sharing rather than weaponizing. "What he hasn't told you is that his father, Robert Ashford, wasn't removed from the plant. He left voluntarily. There are documents, signed documents, showing that Robert Ashford accepted a buyout and retired. The factory's decline came after, under Landon's own management decisions." She looked at him. "You're saying the photograph is a fake." "I'm saying it's being used misleadingly. The meeting it depicts was routine. The date on the back was added later." He held her gaze. "Landon Ashford is a man who inherited his father's grudges, lost the company his father built, and has been trying to reframe his own failures as someone else's corruption for over a year. And the people he's accusing are going to respond to that accusation with everything they have." The rain came down. Emily held the door and said nothing. "I'm not here to threaten you," Falco said. "I'm here because you seem like someone who made a decision based on incomplete information, and I'd hate to see you face legal liability for something you didn't fully understand." "Legal liability," she repeated. "Obstruction, interference with corporate legal process." He said it gently, which was the worst way to say it. "These are serious people, Miss Carter. They have serious attorneys. If you're found to be holding evidence relevant to an ongoing legal matter, are you done?" He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, the pleasantness going thinner, showing something harder underneath. "I'm trying to help you." "I restocked water bottles 2 nights ago and swept the floor," she said. "That's all I know about. You want to talk to someone about briefcases and photographs? You're on the wrong street." She looked at him directly. "Is there anything else?" A pause. He picked his card up off the railing and put it back in his pocket. "You're making a mistake," he said. Not a threat exactly. More like a fact he was recording for later. "Probably," she said. "I make them all the time. Have a good afternoon." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with her back against it and listened to his footsteps going back down the walk and the car door closing and the engine starting. Then she went to the kitchen table and sat down and put her face in her hands for a minute because her legs weren't entirely reliable, and she needed a moment to convince her body that the conversation was over. Then she picked up her phone and called Landon. He answered before the first ring had finished. "Are you okay?" "Falco came to my house." The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long and contained a significant amount of what she guessed was controlled fury. "What did he say?" She told him. All of it, as accurately as she could remember it.
The buyout claim, the signed documents, the photograph being used misleadingly, the legal liability. She kept her voice even because she needed to hear how it sounded when she said it out loud, needed to gauge whether it landed differently outside her own head. It didn't. It sounded like what it was, a man delivering a carefully constructed alternative story to an audience of one, gauging how much of it would stick. "He's lying," Landon said. "There was no voluntary buyout. My father fought them for 18 months before they constructed enough pressure to force him out. The signed document he's referencing..." A pause. "There is a document. It exists. They had him sign it as a condition of keeping his pension, and the language was deliberately written to read like a voluntary retirement. My father explains exactly what happened in the letter he left me." "Can you prove that in 4 days? I mean, by tomorrow morning?" "I don't need to prove the full picture by tomorrow. I need to present enough at the board meeting to force an external investigation. Once regulators get access to the actual financial records..." "Landon." She stopped him. "They're at your house tonight, aren't they?" Another pause. Longer. "I have security." "That's not what I asked." "Victoria called me an hour ago," he said. "She said she needs to meet tonight. She said it was urgent." He exhaled. "I told her to come at 8. You're letting her come. I want to hear what she says." Emily looked at the rain hitting the kitchen window. She thought about what Falco had said. These are serious people. And she thought about the way Landon had described his strategy, letting the conspirators expose themselves by provoking them, using himself as bait. She thought about a man who had spent 14 months being patient and careful, and whether patience and careful had a hard limit somewhere, and whether they were getting close to it. "I'm coming," she said. "You don't need..." "I know I don't need to. I'm coming anyway." She stood up and went to the closet for her raincoat. "Falco came to my house, Landon. He knows where I live. He knows my father lives here. Whatever this is, I'm not sitting in my kitchen waiting to find out how it ends." A long pause. 8 o'clock, he said. "Come to the side entrance. I'll leave it unlocked." She left a note for her father saying she'd been called into work early, which wasn't entirely a lie, and drove through the rain with the photograph tucked inside her jacket and the feeling of moving toward something without being able to clearly see its shape. The estate looked different in the rain and the dark, less imposing and somehow more real. The stone darker, the grounds messier, puddles on the walkway that the expensive landscaping couldn't entirely prevent. She let herself in through the side entrance and found Landon in the kitchen, standing over a counter covered in organized papers, and an older man she didn't know sitting at the table. She stopped. "Emily," Landon said, "this is my father's former operations manager, Frank DeLuca. He worked at the plant for 30 years. Frank DeLuca was in his late 60s, heavy-set, with the hands of someone who'd worked physical work long before management and the expression of a man who'd been sitting on something uncomfortable for a very long time. He looked at Emily with the exhausted recognition of someone who knew who she was. "Gerald Carter's daughter," he said. "You know my father?" "I worked with your father for 14 years. He looked at his hands on the table. "I've been wanting to talk to someone for a long time." She sat down. Landon stayed standing, the way he did when he was too keyed up to sit, and the rain came down outside and Frank DeLuca started talking. He'd been there, he said, for the whole thing. He'd watched Holloway's group move in over the course of 18 months. Quiet at first, just faces at shareholder meetings, then faces in the executive hallway, then voices in the decisions that Robert Ashford was trying to make. He'd watched Robert fight it and slow it down and try to document it, and eventually lose the fight when they built enough pressure on the secondary investors to force a board restructure. And he'd done nothing. That was what he was saying, underneath the facts. He'd watched it happen, and he'd done nothing because he had a wife with medical bills, and a mortgage, and a daughter in college, and he told himself that the facts were complicated, and maybe the new investors had a point, and maybe the plant really did need restructuring, and maybe. "They brought me in during the transition," he said. "Kept me on as operations manager for the first 6 months after Robert left. I saw what they were doing to the supply contracts, the maintenance schedules, the safety reporting. I understood by then what the plan was." His jaw moved. "I accepted a payment, a significant payment.
in exchange for my cooperation and my silence. The kitchen was very quiet except for the rain. Frank, Landon said carefully, what kind of cooperation? I helped them make it look like operational failure. He said it without flinching, which Emily had the sense cost him considerably more than it appeared to. I filed reports I knew were misleading. I signed off on maintenance deferrals I knew were dangerous. When the inspectors came, I knew which answers to give. He looked at Landon. I'm sorry. I know what sorry costs at this point. Landon didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at a fixed point somewhere above the counter, and his expression was the expression of a man doing very hard work inside himself. You're willing to testify, he said. Finally. I've been trying to figure out how to get in front of the right person for 4 months. Frank's voice was rough. Your attorney. I tried to reach Victoria Marsh's office twice. I never heard back. Something passed over Landon's face. She knew you were trying to reach her, he said. It wasn't a question. I assumed she was busy. She wasn't busy. Landon straightened up. She was making sure you didn't reach me. Before anyone could say anything else, they heard the car in the driveway. Emily looked at the clock on the microwave. 7:53. Victoria was early, which meant she'd been moving before she'd even made the call, which meant she knew more about the shape of this night than any of them had realized. Landon went to the front door. Emily stayed in the kitchen with Frank. Through the hallway, she could hear the front door open, and then Victoria's voice, lower than usual, controlled in a way that had a different quality than her normal controlled. I'm not here for the meeting, she said. I need you to listen to me. I'm listening. Whatever you're planning for tomorrow, the board presentation, the documents, whatever evidence you think you have, you need to stand down. A pause. Garrett Holloway's legal team filed a preemptive motion this afternoon. They have a document that directly implicates you in misrepresenting the company's financial position to the board 3 years ago. Landon, it may not be real, but by the time anyone establishes that, the damage will be done. So they're going to frame me. They're going to bury you. There's a difference. Her voice cracked slightly on the word bury, which was the first uncontrolled thing Emily had heard from her. If you walk into that board meeting tomorrow with accusations against Holloway's group, they're ready to detonate your entire reputation, your career, your company, your ability to... She stopped. Your daughter, Landon. Think about what a sustained legal battle does to a child. A long silence from the hallway. Emily looked at Frank across the kitchen table. He was looking at the doorway. Victoria. Landon's voice was very quiet. How did they know I was planning to present tomorrow? Silence. I've only told 3 people about the board meeting plan, he said. My financial analyst, my brother-in-law, and you. Landon. How did Dennis Falco know to go to Emily Carter's house today? A sound. Not quite a word, more the beginning of several different sentences that all stopped before they started. How long? He asked. The silence stretched out long enough that Emily found herself holding her breath without meaning to. It wasn't, I didn't give them anything that would hurt you. Victoria's voice had lost its architecture. She sounded like a person who had been holding a structure up by sheer will for a long time and had just put it down. They came to me 8 months ago, after your father died, when I was managing the estate, the legal transition, everything, and they approached me and told me what they had on the company, and I thought... She stopped. I thought I was protecting you, keeping you from doing something that would destroy what your father built. My father built something they stole. I'm trying to get it back. You're trying to fight people who have significantly more resources and significantly less scruple than you do, and you were going to lose. Her voice went flat. I told them minimal things, scheduling, movements. I told them where you were driving Tuesday night so they could intercept the briefcase before you reached your attorney. Emily thought, so it wasn't a random stop at the gas station at all. He'd been driving a specific route, and they'd known he was on it, and he'd pulled in to get gas, and he'd left the briefcase at pump 2, and the whole thing had pivoted on that one careless moment. They were supposed to take it quietly, Victoria said. No one was supposed to... There's a gas station attendant who got followed home in the middle of the night, Landon said. His voice was still quiet, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had gotten louder. "There's a 63-year-old man with a heart condition whose house Falco visited this afternoon. No one was supposed to, what, Victoria, be inconvenienced?" She didn't answer. "Get out," he said. Go home. Don't call me." "Landon, I'm going to give you the night to decide whether you want to come forward voluntarily tomorrow or whether you want to find out what obstruction looks like from the other side." He opened the front door. Emily heard it. "Good night, Victoria." The sound of heels on the stone walkway. The car door. The engine. Landon came back into the kitchen. He looked like a man who'd just had a filling replaced without anesthetic. Functional, but clearly at cost. He looked at Frank. "I need a full written statement. Everything you just told me, with dates where you can remember them. I need it tonight." Frank nodded. He'd brought a folder, which said something about why he'd actually come. Then Landon looked at Emily. She'd pulled the photograph out of her jacket and was holding it on the table. "You should take this now," she said. "I don't want it in my coat any longer than it needs to be." He sat down across from her and took the photograph and looked at it for a long moment, his father's handshake with Holloway. "They know in pencil and pen on the back." "He was scared when he wrote that," Landon said. Not to her specifically, more like thinking out loud. He wasn't a man who scared easily. Emily thought about her own father with the termination notice at the kitchen table. Different kind of loss, different kind of quiet. "He kept going anyway," she said. "He kept going anyway." Landon looked up. "I've been trying to do the same thing. I don't know if I've done it right." "You won't know until tomorrow." He almost laughed. It was a tired, genuine, slightly broken sound, and it was the most human thing she'd heard from him in 3 days. "That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be." She stood. "I need to get home before my father gets back and finds the note I left him." She paused. "Frank's statement. Get it notarized tonight if you can. There's a 24-hour place on Miller Street, the UPS store." Landon blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because I've had to notarize things at 11 at night twice in the past year. This town doesn't run on business hours anymore." She picked up her raincoat. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that I'm not sorry I drove out that night. Even with Falco showing up and the SUV and all of it." He looked at her. "Why?" She thought about it for a real moment. The real answer, not the convenient one. "Because my father spent 22 years working for a place that someone decided wasn't worth protecting," she said. "And it's been a long time since anyone decided it was worth fighting for." She looked at him directly. "Don't lose tomorrow." She drove home in the rain. Her father was already back, sitting in front of the news with his soup from the fridge, and he looked at her when she came in and said, "You look like you've been somewhere more complicated than work." "I'll tell you about it," she said, "when it's over." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded and turned back to the television, and she sat down beside him, and the rain kept coming down outside. And somewhere across town, Dennis Falco was making phone calls she couldn't hear, and in the Ashford estate, a tired man and a guilt-ridden former operations manager were writing down everything they knew, and the board meeting was 9 hours away. She didn't sleep again that night. Neither, she was fairly certain, did Landon Ashford. The Ashford Industries boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Millfield that had been built in the early 90s and had the particular kind of corporate gravity that came from decades of decisions made inside it. Some of them good, most of them expensive, a few of them irreversible. The windows faced east, and in the morning light, they caught the sun in a way that was probably intended to feel optimistic and mostly just felt blinding. Landon arrived at 7:42. 18 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. He'd slept maybe 2 hours. He knew because he'd watched the clock through most of the night, lying in the dark in the house that felt too large and too quiet, with his daughter at his sister's and Frank DeLuca's notarized statement in the briefcase beside the bed and the photograph in the inside pocket of his jacket where he kept reaching up to check it was still there every 40 minutes. At 5, he'd given up on sleep and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table reading through the evidence one final time. Not because he didn't know it, but because he needed to hear it in his own head the way a musician runs through a piece before a performance. Not to learn it, to settle into it. The board had 11 members. 4 of them he trusted completely. People his father had appointed. people who'd been with the company long enough to remember what it had been before Holloway's group showed up. 3 of them he knew were aligned with the investors, placed in the past 4 years as the board composition shifted under the pressure of Holloway's stake accumulation. The other 4 were the ones that mattered. The ones who'd spent 18 months watching Landon weather the public blame for the plant closure and had reached no visible conclusion about his guilt or innocence beyond a general sense of discomfort with the whole situation. Those 4 were the people he was actually speaking to today. The others had already made up their minds in one direction or the other. He sat up at the head of the table himself because the AV assistant hadn't arrived yet, and he didn't want to wait. His laptop, the projector, the briefcase open with the physical documents organized in the order he planned to present them. He'd thought about hiring a presentation consultant 2 weeks ago and decided against it because the last thing he needed was to walk in there looking like a man performing confidence rather than a man telling the truth. And there was a difference, and experienced board members could feel it. He was checking the projector connection when the door opened. He expected a board member. He got Gerald Carter. He stood very still for a moment, processing the fact of Emily's father standing in the doorway of the Ashford Industries boardroom at 7:44 in the morning. Gerald Carter was in his good jacket, the one that was slightly too big in the shoulders. Now in the way clothing gets when a person loses weight they weren't planning to lose. And he had his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had decided to do something and was committed to it regardless of how he felt about it. "Mr. Carter," Landon said carefully. "She told me," Gerald said, "last night after she came home." He came in without being invited, which Landon noted and respected simultaneously. "She told me everything, the briefcase, the photograph, Falco coming to the house." He stopped a few feet inside the door. "She didn't tell me she was planning to drive out to your place that first night. I figured that out on my own. I'm sorry for involving her. She involved herself." Gerald said it without particular warmth or coldness, just accuracy. "That's what she does. Gets involved in things she shouldn't, works twice as hard as anyone tells her to, and doesn't ask for credit." He looked at the briefcase on the table. "I'm not here to give you trouble. I want to understand what you're doing and whether it's real." Landon pulled out a chair. "Sit down." Gerald sat. Landon sat across from him, and for a few minutes before the board members started arriving, before the day became what it was going to become, he told Emily's father everything. Not the curated version he'd give the board. The real version. His father's letter. The 18 months of watching and waiting. The photograph and what it meant and why they'd been trying so hard to get it back. Gerald listened without interrupting, which Landon had the sense was not entirely characteristic of him, but was the choice he was making right now. When Landon finished, Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Robert Ashford was a decent man," he said finally. "I worked for him for 14 years and I didn't always agree with him. And once I thought he made a decision that was genuinely wrong, and I told him so to his face." He paused. He listened. He didn't change what he'd decided, but he listened. That matters to me. Landon said nothing. He didn't trust himself to say anything. "The morning after the termination notices went out," Gerald said, "I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. My daughter was there. She didn't know what to say, so she made coffee and she sat with me, and we didn't talk about it. And I don't remember how long we sat there, but I remember thinking that I should have fought harder while there was still something to fight." His jaw moved. "I'm 63 years old with a damaged heart and 2 part-time jobs. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you that because I want you to know what's sitting in this room with you today, besides documents." "I know," Landon said. "Then don't waste it." The door opened again. Margaret Wu, the board's longest-serving independent member, came in with her coffee and stopped when she saw Gerald and looked at Landon with a question in her expression. "He was part of the plant's workforce for 22 years, Landon said. "He's here as a witness." Margaret looked at Gerald for a moment. Something moved across her face. She sat down 2 seats away and opened her notebook and didn't say anything else. The rest of the board filtered in over the next 12 minutes. Landon watched their faces as they registered Gerald Carter sitting at the boardroom table. The 4 he trusted showed recognition. They knew the plant workers, or had, before everything fell apart. The 3 aligned with Holloway's group showed something more like calculation. The 4 undecided showed the particular careful blankness of people who were waiting to understand which way this was going before they committed to a reaction. Holloway's people were not in the room. They were investors, not board members. By design, by the structure of the company as Robert Ashford had built it, the board maintained separation from the investment group. But their proxies were there, and Landon knew which faces to watch. At 8 on the dot, he started. He didn't begin with the evidence. He started with the plant, the way it had been, the employment numbers, the benefit structure, the safety record, the 22 years of genuinely solid operation that preceded the decline. He put numbers on the screen because numbers were harder to dismiss than feelings, and he went through them methodically and without editorial comment because he wanted the board to arrive at the conclusions themselves rather than feel they were being walked toward them. He saw Gerald watching the numbers with the expression of a man recognizing a landscape he'd lived in. Then he went back 9 years. He showed the timeline of Holloway's group acquiring their stake, the quiet 18-month accumulation of shares through intermediary accounts that had been specifically structured to stay below the disclosure threshold at each individual step, but which, taken together, represented a coordinated strategy to obtain controlling influence without triggering public notice. He put the financial records on the screen and let them be read in silence. "These records," said one of the Holloway-aligned board members, a man named Prescott, 50s, silver-haired, with the deliberate ease of someone who'd learned to perform relaxation, were obtained how exactly? "Through proper legal discovery in a related proceeding," Landon said. "They're certified. The certification documents are in your physical packets, tab 3. Prescott opened his packet to tab 3 and looked at it and closed it again without expression. Landon moved forward. The supply contract manipulations. The maintenance deferrals. He put Frank DeLuca's notarized statement on the screen, the full text of it, and he let it sit there long enough for everyone in the room to reach the part where Frank described what he'd been asked to do and what he'd agreed to do and what he'd witnessed. He watched the 4 undecideds reading. He watched their faces change slowly, the careful blankness giving way to something more uncomfortable and more real. Then he put the photograph on the screen. Just the photograph. Robert Ashford and Garrett Holloway, 9 years ago, in front of the plant. The date, the handshake. "This photograph," Landon said, "documents a meeting between my father and Garrett Holloway that Holloway's legal representatives have denied under oath took place. The date establishes it occurred 3 weeks before the first documented pressure on my father to accept board restructuring. The context of the meeting, as described in my father's contemporaneous notes, which are in your packets at tab 7, establishes that this was not a routine shareholder introduction. Holloway came to my father with an offer. My father refused it. What happened over the following 18 months was the consequence of that refusal." He turned to face the room. "I want to tell you something that I should have told this board 14 months ago," he said. "And I want to tell it to you now because it's the truth, and because this room deserves the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable for me personally." Prescott shifted in his seat. "I knew, approximately 14 months ago, that the public narrative around the plant closure was wrong. I had partial evidence, not enough to act on legally, but enough to know the direction of the truth." He held the room. "I made a deliberate choice not to correct that narrative immediately. I allowed this company, this board, and this community to operate under a false understanding of events, because I believed, and I still believe, that the only way to fully expose what had been done was to allow the people responsible to believe they were winning." He paused. "That was a strategic decision. It was also a deception. It was a deception I practiced against this board, and against the people of Calverton, and I am not standing here pretending it wasn't." The room was absolutely silent. "I'm telling you this now because if I don't, Holloway's attorneys will tell you later, and they will frame it as proof that I can't be trusted, and they are not wrong that it raises questions about my trustworthiness." He looked at Margaret Wu, who was watching him with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between honesty and performance. "The difference between what I did and what they did is not that I was deceptive and they were not. The difference is what the deception was in service of. I ask you to weigh that. I am not asking you to excuse it." Another Holloway-aligned board member, a woman named Chen, younger than Prescott, with the energy of someone who'd been waiting for a cue, said, "Mr. Ashford, you're asking this board to accept that you deliberately misled us for over a year as a tactic, and that we should trust the evidence you're now presenting as a result of that tactic. Yes, he said, that's exactly what I'm asking. And if we don't accept that, then you don't accept it. The regulatory submission goes forward regardless. The evidence exists independently of whether you trust me. I'm presenting it here first as a courtesy to this board and as a matter of record, not because your acceptance is the mechanism. Chen looked at him. Something moved in her expression that he couldn't fully read. Gerald Carter, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table since the presentation began, said, "Can I say something?" 11 heads turned toward him. He didn't wait for permission. "I'm not on this board," he said. "I'm a man who worked in that plant for 22 years and lost his pension and his position when it closed, and I've spent 18 months believing I knew who was responsible." He looked at Landon. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong because I knew Robert Ashford, and I knew the plant, and the story we were all told about what happened never quite fit what I actually knew, but I wanted someone to blame, and the name I was given was convenient." He looked around the table. "What this man is telling you is the truth. I can't speak to every document in front of you, but I can tell you that Robert Ashford was not a man who ran his business the way his son just described the investors running it. And I can tell you that 30 years of working a factory floor teaches you the difference between a place being mismanaged and a place being deliberately dismantled." His voice didn't waver. "That plant was deliberately dismantled. We all felt it happening. We just didn't know where to look." The room was quiet again, a different kind of quiet than before. Prescott said, "This is highly irregular." "He's right," said one of the 4 undecideds. A man named Brower, who'd been on the board for 6 years and had a reputation for being impossible to predict. "About the plant. I've reviewed the operational records independently, and the decline pattern is not consistent with ordinary mismanagement. The pattern is consistent with deliberate acceleration." He looked at Prescott. "I've thought so for 8 months. I didn't say anything because I didn't have a mechanism." He looked at Landon. "Now, there's a mechanism." Prescott stood up. "I need to make a call before this board takes any action." "Sit down, Edward," Margaret Wu said. She said it the way a person says something they've been waiting to say for a long time. Prescott looked at her. He sat down. "Mr. Ashford," Margaret said, "you said you were willing to give up your position as chairman to ensure this evidence couldn't be characterized as self-interested. I want to hear you say that again on the record clearly, so there's no ambiguity." Landon had known this moment was coming. He'd prepared for it, which meant he'd thought about it at length in the dark of the previous several nights. What it would actually feel like to say the words out loud in the room where his father had once sat. He told himself it was the right thing. He still believed that. It wasn't the believing that was hard. "I am prepared to resign the chairmanship effective immediately upon this board's decision to refer the evidence to the appropriate regulatory authorities," he said. "I will provide full cooperation with any investigation. I will not seek to retain executive authority during that process." He paused. "I built this company after my father built it, and I love it in the way you love something that cost you a great deal. Giving up the chairmanship cost me more than most things I've done. I'm doing it because the people of Calverton are owed a conclusion that cannot be questioned, and my presence in this chair gives the other side a reason to question it." The room held its breath. It was Brower who moved first, pulled the formal motion document from his packet, signed it, passed it to the person beside him. Margaret signed it. Then 2 more of the undecideds. Then, after a long moment in which the air in the room seemed to change quality, a 5th signature from someone Landon hadn't expected. Prescott and Chen did not sign. They sat very still and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. 6 signatures was enough. The motion passed. Landon looked at the signed document in front of him and felt something release in his chest that had been held tight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief implied the outcome had been uncertain and that the uncertainty was now resolved. This felt older than that, more like something that had been owed for a long time had finally been acknowledged. He looked at Gerald Carter. Gerald was looking at the photograph on the projector screen. Robert Ashford and Garrett Holloway. "They know on the back." "He kept writing things down," Gerald said quietly. Not to the room, more to himself. "He did," Landon said. Gerald nodded once, slowly, and looked down at his hat on the table. The board members began moving, gathering documents, the particular choreography of a meeting that had reached its conclusion
and still had to be unwound logistically. Margaret Wu came over and looked at Landon directly and said, "It took a long time." "Yes. Too long, probably." "Yes," he said. "I know." She nodded, which wasn't forgiveness and wasn't absolution, but was something. An acknowledgement that she'd heard him, that the accounting was being taken seriously. By 10 that morning, the regulatory referral had been filed. By noon, Landon had received the first call from federal investigators confirming receipt. By 2, Garrett Holloway's attorneys had issued a statement that was so precisely worded and so carefully measured in its denial of wrongdoing that it read, "To anyone with experience in how these things worked, like a document written by people who already knew the game was over and were trying to control how it ended." Prescott called Landon's cell phone at 2:15. Landon didn't pick up. He was sitting in his car in the parking garage beneath the Millfield building, and he was looking at the photograph one more time before he put it back in the briefcase for the last time. His father's face. Young-looking, even though he hadn't been young. The kind of face that had believed, apparently, in doing things the right way, even when doing things the right way, was costly. He'd thought about his father every day for 14 months. He thought about him differently now. Not as an ideal to live up to. That framing had always felt slightly dishonest, like he was turning the man into a version of himself that didn't include the early contractor issue or the overtime decision or any of the other ways Robert Ashford had been a real person who made imperfect choices. He thought about him now as a man who'd reached a hard moment and had written things down instead of looking away. That was all. It was enough. He drove to his sister's house to pick up his daughter. Maya was 5, and she'd inherited her late mother's habit of asking questions in rapid succession without waiting for the answer to one before moving to the next, which Landon found exhausting and quietly treasured in equal measure. She was in the front yard when he pulled up, wearing a raincoat even though it wasn't raining, engaged in some project with a stick and a patch of dirt. She looked up when she heard his car and ran over, and he got out, and she grabbed his hand and said, "Did you do the thing today?" He looked down at her. "What thing?" "The important thing. Aunt Rachel said you had an important thing today." "I did it," he said. She considered this. "Did it work?" He thought about the signed motion, about Gerald Carter's face looking at the photograph, about 14 months and the weight that had been in his chest for all of them. "Yes," he said. "It worked." "Good." She went back to her project with the stick. "I made a picture for Emily. Aunt Rachel said she's the one who helped." Landon stood by the car and watched his daughter drawing something in the dirt and thought about a woman who'd driven 40 miles in the middle of the night to return something that wasn't hers to keep, and how that single act had changed the shape of everything that followed. "She did help," he said. "Can we bring her the picture?" He looked at the drawing in the dirt, which would not survive being transported anywhere, and said, "You can make her a new one, on paper." Maya looked at him with the expression of someone who found this a reasonable compromise and immediately went to find paper, which meant going inside, which meant the project with the stick was concluded. He followed her in. The resignation letter he had to write could wait another hour. There was a drawing that needed to be made, and some things were in the right order and some things weren't, and right now this one was. The resignation letter took him 3 drafts and most of an evening, not because he didn't know what to say. He'd known the substance of it for weeks, had run through the language in his head during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, but because there's a difference between deciding to give something up and actually writing the sentence that makes it real. The first draft was too formal, the kind of letter written by a man performing dignity rather than feeling it. The second draft went too far in the other direction and read like an apology letter, which wasn't what this was. The third draft said what it needed to say in plain language, that he was resigning the chairmanship effective immediately, that he would cooperate fully with the investigation, that he believed the company his father built was worth saving, and that saving it required removing himself from the center of it. He signed it at 10:15 at night, with Maya already asleep down the hall, and he sat looking at his signature for a moment before folding it into an envelope. It occurred to him that he'd been so focused on what the letter cost him that he hadn't thought clearly about what it didn't cost him. He was still a shareholder. He still had resources that most people would consider extraordinary. He had his daughter and his health, and a house that was too large but which held, in the room with the child's drawings on the walls, something worth considerably more than its square footage. He thought about his father, who'd lost considerably more than a chairmanship and had kept writing things down anyway. He put the envelope in his briefcase, a different briefcase, a smaller one. The black leather one was in a box in the attic, and went to bed.
He slept for 7 hours without interruption, which was the longest unbroken sleep he'd managed in 14 months. The investigation moved faster than anyone had publicly predicted and considerably slower than everyone privately hoped. That was the nature of regulatory proceedings. They had their own velocity, governed by rules and procedures that existed for legitimate reasons and that nonetheless made people who were waiting for justice feel like they were watching something happen through very thick glass. Garrett Holloway's legal team filed 3 separate motions in the first 2 weeks attempting to have the evidence excluded on procedural grounds. All 3 failed. Dennis Falco, who had apparently understood immediately which way things were going and had made a calculation accordingly, contacted the lead investigator in the second week and offered cooperation in exchange for consideration of his own exposure. The investigators accepted. His testimony about the original operation to remove Robert Ashford from the plant, the detailed operational testimony of a man who had actually executed the plan rather than simply ordered it, filled in the gaps in the documentary record in a way that no amount of paper evidence could have done on its own. Victoria Marsh's situation was more complicated. She'd retained independent counsel the morning after the board meeting and had spent 3 days apparently doing very hard thinking before she came forward voluntarily with a full accounting of her communications with Holloway's people over the previous 8 months. The investigators considered her exposure in light of her cooperation and ultimately made a decision that satisfied almost no one. She avoided criminal prosecution but surrendered her law license and faced civil liability that effectively ended her career. Landon heard about the license surrender from his new legal team and sat with that information for a while before deciding how he felt about it. He didn't feel good about it. He also didn't feel that the outcome was wrong. Those 2 things coexisted, and he let them. The part that took the longest was the piece that mattered most to the 340 families of Calverton, which was what happened to the plant itself and the land it sat on. Holloway's group had structured their acquisition of the land through 3 separate holding companies, which meant unwinding it was a legal process of considerable complexity that stretched over several months and generated the kind of paperwork that fills entire storage rooms. The lawyers involved billed accordingly. Emily read about it in the local paper, which she still got in physical form because her father liked the crossword. She read about it in stages: the initial investigation announcement, the first court filings, the preliminary findings, the eventual settlement structure that emerged after Holloway's group, faced with the complete evidentiary picture, decided that fighting all the way to trial was not a calculation that favored them. She was working her shift at the gas station when she read about the settlement. The flickering light had finally been replaced. The new owner of the station, who'd bought it from the previous owner in November, had replaced all the lights and repainted the canopy and fixed the card reader on pump 2, which no longer ate cards. The changes made the place feel strange to her for a few weeks, the way any familiar thing feels strange when it changes. Then it just felt like work again, which was what it had always been. She'd applied for an accounting position at a firm in Millfield in October. She'd gotten the second interview and then not gotten the job, which had stung in the particular way that things sting when you've convinced yourself to hope. And she'd gone home and made dinner and not told her father until 2 days later when she'd processed it enough to talk about it without her jaw getting tight. "You'll get the next one," he'd said. "Maybe. You will." He'd said it with the particular calm of a man who had learned to read his daughter accurately over the course of 30 years. "You're good at this. You were always good at numbers. Numbers don't always lead anywhere. They do if you stay with them long enough." She'd stayed with them. She applied to 3 more firms and got the third one. A smaller operation in Millfield, 4 people and a lot of small business clients. Nothing glamorous, but real work that used the degree she'd gotten at 22 and that had seemed for a while like it was going to be permanently decorative. She gave her notice at the gas station on a Thursday. Her supervisor, who'd been expecting it for a while based on nothing except the particular air of a person who is mentally already somewhere else, told her she'd been a good employee and that the overnight inventory was never going to be as accurate without her, which was the most sincere compliment she'd ever received in that building. She worked her last shift on a Friday night in late January. It was cold and quiet, and she restocked the cooler and swept the floor and counted the register and did all the things she'd done hundreds of times in that place. And when she was done, she stood in the booth for a moment and looked at the pumps and the road and the dark. And she thought about a black Mercedes pulling in on a summer night and a briefcase sitting on the ground by pump 2 and a decision she'd made in about 3 minutes of standing at the register that had changed the shape of the months that followed. She thought, it's strange, the things that pivot on small moments. Then she turned off the lights and locked up and left. The plant reopened in March. Not all of it. The full facility was too large for the initial operating scale, and the new management, a restructured board under independent oversight, was being deliberately conservative about the ramp-up. But the main production floor opened, and with it 87 positions, with a committed plan for expansion to 220 by the end of the first operating year contingent on output. It wasn't what the plant had been. It was the beginning of something that could, given time and competent management and the absence of people deliberately running it into the ground, become what it had been. The reopening ceremony was on a Saturday morning. It was not a large event, no media coverage beyond the local paper, no speeches from officials looking to attach themselves to a good story at the last minute. Just the new plant manager, a woman named Sokolowski who'd run a similar facility in western Pennsylvania for 12 years, and who had the particular manner of someone who had agreed to take on a difficult job because she thought she could do it well, rather than because she wanted the credit for it, saying a few words in the parking lot. The families of some of the original workers were there, some of the workers themselves, the ones who'd been rehired from the original workforce. Gerald Carter was there. He stood near the back of the small crowd with his hands in his coat pockets and watched Sokolowski cut the ribbon and watched the main doors open and listen to the first sounds of the production line starting up. The particular combination of mechanical sounds that he'd heard 5 days a week for 22 years and had not heard since the morning the plant closed. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and listened to it. Emily was beside him. She noticed that he didn't speak and she didn't say anything either because some moments don't need commentary. She watched his face in profile and saw the complicated thing happening there. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, something older and more layered than either of those. The expression of a person watching an account partially settled that will never be fully settled because the years it took are not returnable. She reached over and took his hand. He let her. They stood like that until the ceremony was over. Landon was not at the reopening. He'd been invited and had declined, specifically because he didn't want the reopening to be about him. He sent a contribution toward the Worker Transition Fund anonymously, which was not entirely anonymous because the fund administrator recognized the source and mentioned it to exactly one person, who mentioned it to exactly one other person, and so on, in the way that things travel in small communities regardless of the intention behind them. He didn't mind. He'd stopped trying to control how things looked some time ago and found the experience of not trying considerably less exhausting than he'd expected. He'd taken a position on the board of a nonprofit focused on manufacturing workforce development. Not a chairmanship, not a leadership role, just a board seat where his knowledge of the industry was useful and where the work was real and unglamorous and mattered to people whose names he'd learned individually. He worked from home most days. He took Maya to school in the morning and picked her up in the afternoon and was home for dinner in a way he hadn't been when running the company. And Maya, who at 5 had accepted the rhythms of her life with the equanimity of someone who hadn't yet learned to compare her circumstances to alternatives, had begun asking him questions at dinner that he found simultaneously delightful and impossible. Where do numbers come from? Why is wood brown? What happened to the factory people? That last one on a Wednesday evening over pasta that he'd slightly overcooked because he'd been distracted by a phone call gave him pause. What do you mean? He asked. The factory people. The ones who lost their jobs. She was winding pasta around her fork with intense concentration. Are they okay now? He thought about how to answer this in a way that was true and appropriate for a 5-year-old, which was a constraint that required more honesty than most adult conversations. Some of them are getting jobs at the factory again, he said. Some of them found other jobs. Some of them are still looking. It's not all okay, but it's better than it was. Maya considered this. Did you fix it? I helped, he said. Some other people helped more. Who? He thought about Emily Carter driving 40 miles in the middle of the night. He thought about Frank DeLuca sitting at his kitchen table with a folder he'd been carrying for 4 months waiting for the right moment. He thought about Gerald Carter in the boardroom with his hat in his hands. "Someone who works at a gas station," he said. Maya looked up from her pasta. "Why does a gas station person help?" "Because she thought it was right," he said, "and she didn't wait for someone else to do it first." Maya looked back at her pasta and thought about this in the way children think about things that land somewhere real, not yet processed into the neat categories that adults use to file experiences away. "I want to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Not wait for someone else first." He looked at his daughter across the table. She was wearing a shirt with a horse on it that was slightly too small and had pasta sauce on her chin and was utterly unaware of how precisely she'd identified the thing he'd been trying to figure out how to be for the past several years. "Me too," he said. The first Friday that Emily worked at the new accounting firm, she finished at 5:30 and drove home the long way, which took her past the gas station. The new lights were on, bright even, not a flicker anywhere. The pumps were clean. There were 2 cars getting gas and a woman with a stroller walking past on the sidewalk. Just ordinary 5:30 on a Friday life, happening in a place she'd spent 14 months in the dark. She didn't stop. She drove past and kept going. The following Friday, just after her shift ended, she was at her desk finishing a reconciliation report when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number immediately, and then she did. "I drove past the gas station today," Landon said when she picked up. "So did I, last week. They fixed the lights." "I noticed." A pause. The comfortable kind. The kind that happens between people who've been through something together and don't need to fill every second with words. "I'm taking Maya for coffee," he said. "She's been asking about the gas station person for 3 weeks. I told her the gas station person has a new job now, and probably better things to do on a Friday evening, but she's persistent." "She's 5, Emily said. "Persistent is what they do." "Is that a yes or a no?" She looked at the reconciliation report on her screen. She looked at her coat on the hook by the door. "There's a place on 4th that has decent coffee," she said. "Better than gas station coffee, anyway. Everything is better than gas station coffee. You clearly haven't worked there long enough to get used to it." He laughed. A real laugh, not the tired, almost laugh she'd heard in those first few days. It was a better sound. 4th Street, he said. 20 minutes? 20 minutes, she said. She saved the report and shut down her computer and put on her coat. Outside the office window, the last of the Friday afternoon light was going orange over the Millfield rooftops. The particular color that late winter light gets in this part of the country when it's trying to convince you spring is coming, even though the temperature still disagrees. She thought about the series of small decisions that had led here, each one seeming, in the moment, like a relatively minor choice. A briefcase on the ground next to pump 2. A woman standing at a register deciding whether to fill out an incident form or do something else. 40 miles in the dark. A photograph in a coat lining. A door she'd opened when she almost didn't. There's something people say about integrity, that it's what you do when no one's watching. Emily had never found that framing entirely satisfying because it suggested that the watching was what made it matter. What she'd come to think instead was that integrity was more like a muscle, not something you had or didn't have, but something that responded to use. The decision at the gas station hadn't been made by a better version of herself. It had been made by the regular version, tired and overworked, and with a father at home with a damaged heart, standing at a register at midnight just trying to figure out the right thing. She hadn't known what would follow from it. She still didn't think knowing would have changed the decision, but she couldn't be certain. Maybe that was the point. Maybe you couldn't make the decision if you saw it clearly for what it was. You had to make it in the half-dark with incomplete information and a body that was telling you to go home. She walked out of the office and down the stairs and onto the street. The coffee place on 4th was small and warm and had the particular ambient noise of people ending their week. Conversations unwinding, coats being draped over chairbacks, the sound of a city at 5:30 on a Friday. She got there first and found a table near the window and ordered a coffee she didn't strictly need and waited. They arrived 4 minutes later. Landon in a jacket that wasn't rumpled this time, and Maya beside him in a coat with toggles that she'd clearly chosen herself based on personal preference rather than any functional criteria. holding a folded piece of paper that she was carrying with the solemnity of someone transporting something important. They spotted Emily through the window before they came in. Maya pointed. Landon said something to her. Emily couldn't hear it through the glass. And Maya nodded seriously, and they came inside. Maya walked up to the table and held out the folded paper. I made you a picture, she said, because you helped. Emily took it. She unfolded it carefully. It was drawn in crayon, a gas station, recognizable by the pumps and the approximate shape of a canopy, and two figures standing next to it, one noticeably taller than the other, and above them in unsteady capital letters. Thank you, Emily. She looked at it for a moment. This is really good, she said. Maya sat down in the chair across from her with the practicality of someone who had delivered her gift and was now ready to move on to the next thing. Do you still work at the gas station? No, Emily said. I have a different job now. Numbers. Numbers. Maya considered this. My dad does numbers too. Not really, Landon said, sitting down. You do. You told me. I said I work with people who do numbers. Maya looked between them with the expression of someone who found this distinction unpersuasive. Both numbers, she concluded, and picked up the children's menu the server had left. Landon met Emily's eyes across the table. There was something in the look that neither of them had the language for yet. Not because the language didn't exist, but because it was too early, and some things needed time to find their names. What they'd been through together was too strange and too compressed for ordinary categories. Not friends exactly. Friendship was built in ordinary time, and they'd met in the middle of a crisis. Not strangers anymore, so that had expired somewhere around the second phone call. Something in between that was still becoming. He said, How's the new job? Reconciliation reports and small business tax filings, she said. Less dramatic than briefcases. Good. Drama is overrated. You didn't think so 14 months ago. I've revised my position. She smiled. He looked like he might cautiously be doing the same. The coffee came. Maya ordered hot chocolate and asked the server 3 questions in rapid succession and was deeply unsatisfied with 2 of the answers. The coffee place on 4th was warm, and Calverton outside was slowly becoming a place that was rebuilding itself with the imperfect, halting energy of a town that had been knocked down hard and was getting back up. Not because it was easy, but because there wasn't a better option. Gerald Carter, at that same moment, was at home watching the news with a bowl of soup, and the local segment ran a piece on the plant reopening with footage from the ceremony, and he watched it with the remote in his hand and didn't change the channel. And when it ended, he turned the TV off and sat in the quiet for a while. He thought about 22 years and what they'd cost and what they'd built and what it meant that some of it was coming back. Not all of it. The years didn't come back. The men he'd worked alongside who died in the interim didn't come back. And there were several of them, and he thought about each of them by name in the quiet of the living room. The jobs were coming back. The sounds were coming back. The parking lot on a Monday morning. It wasn't justice exactly. Justice was a word that implied accounts could be fully balanced, and he'd lived long enough to know that some debts were too large for full settlement. What it was instead was something smaller and more durable. The acknowledgement that something wrong had been done, and the attempt, imperfect, partial, too slow, to do something right in response. He thought about his daughter taking his hand at the reopening and not saying anything. He thought that was probably enough for now. That sometimes enough was the best available category. He went to the kitchen to wash his bowl, and outside the window the night was settling over Calverton with the ordinary, unhurried patience that nights have, regardless of what happened during the day. The stars coming out over the hills, the streetlights flickering on, the sound of the town doing what towns do when the day is over, and the work of tomorrow hasn't started yet. Back on 4th Street, Maya had finished her hot chocolate and was asking Landon to explain why the spoon left a ring on the napkin, which he could not fully explain, which she found unsatisfying. Emily watched the 2 of them, the tired, careful man and the relentless 5-year-old, and thought about how strange it was that the biggest turns in a life so often came disguised as small things. A car at the wrong pump, a briefcase left behind, a woman at a register deciding in 3 minutes what kind of person she was going to be. She folded Maya's drawing and put it in her bag. Outside the window, the evening moved through Calverton. The plant would run its production line on Monday. Gerald Carter would go to work at the hardware store and be slightly less tired than he'd been for the past year and a half. Frank DeLuca would testify in the civil proceedings and then go home to the house where he'd been carrying something heavy for too long. And he'd put it down, and the putting down of it would feel strange before it felt like relief. Garrett Holloway would spend the next several years in legal proceedings that would cost him a significant portion of what he'd built on other people's losses. Victoria Marsh would look for a different way to use what she knew how to do, in a smaller room, with considerably more humility than she'd entered the previous room with. Dennis Falco would cooperate with investigators and receive his consideration and go back to whatever work he found next, because people like Falco always found the next thing, and the world was imperfect in ways that even good outcomes couldn't fully address. And at a table near the window of a coffee place on 4th Street, a woman who'd once worked the midnight shift at a gas station on Route 9 was having coffee with a man who had spent 14 months being patient and a child who was currently explaining to that same man, with great conviction, that spoons were unfair. It was not a perfect ending. There were no perfect endings, only real ones, with loose threads and unresolved questions, and people still in the middle of becoming whoever they were going to be. Gerald Carter's heart was still damaged and always would be. The plant was starting at 87 jobs, not 340. Emily had student loan debt that the new job would help with but not immediately resolve. Landon had a daughter who'd grown up in the shadow of a year and a half of difficulty and would carry some version of that in ways that wouldn't be visible for a while. But the photograph was in the hands of federal investigators now, doing what Robert Ashford had intended it to do when he'd written, "They know" on the back of it in pencil and then gone over it in pen because pencil fades. The truth was on the record. The families of Calverton knew what had actually happened to them, which was not a small thing. Knowing the true shape of what was done to you is part of how you stop doing the thing where you carry the blame for someone else's choices. And a man and a woman and a 5-year-old were having coffee on a Friday evening, and the light outside was going the particular color it gets when the day is ending well, and none of them could see clearly what came next. That was all right. Some things were better found than planned.